So, some days you wake up and you think you've had the best idea in the world ever. I'd recently nearly finished my AC Cobra replica and was looking round for the next idea when it came to me. I will build a car from scratch. But I didn't want to build the usual Caterham Lotus 7 type replica. Oh no, I thought I would build something a little bit more interesting. I'd always loved the Art Deco cars from the 1930s, such as Bugattis and Delahides, so I decided it had to look like that. However, when it came to engine choice, I thought about the usual options of a straight 6 BMW engine or a Rover V8, but in the end, I decided it needed to be a little bit more exotic. So for me, the only choice was a V12. So I started looking at the possibilities and the options. There's a BMW V12, a Mercedes V12. But as these ideas start to occur and then they get bigger and bigger, in the end there was only one choice, a Jaguar V12 6 litre. After all, a V8 is only a couple of cylinders more than a straight 6. And if we're adding cylinders, a V12 is only a few more cylinders than a V8. And it's a well-known fact that even Jaguar themselves made the V12 installation in their own cars really simple to understand. So that was all decided. I had a car body style, I had an engine picked out. All I had to do now was work out how I was going to build it. The obvious choice would have been to pick a chassis from an existing vehicle. Or, if I decided to build my own chassis, to go for something simple like a ladder frame. So of course, I took the obvious route and built a complicated backbone chassis. And next, it was time to build the body shell. And the obvious thing here would have been to make everything from fiberglass, but that's too easy. So I decided to build half of it from steel and half of it from fiberglass. So it was around this time that I took a good long look at the doors. And I decided that at the end of the day, I just didn't like them. So I redesigned them in steel from scratch. First, I cut the tops of the doors off. I then welded in a steel frame. I used paper or cardboard to create templates, and then panel beat the metal skin to go over the top. Finally, I used the door handles from a Fiat Barchetta as they're really in keeping with the design style of the rest of the car. This car was designed as a roadster, so it doesn't have a roof. Obviously, I added a roof. But I didn't want a simple canvas roof, so I've added a metal folding hardtop. At this point, the bodywork was nearly finished, so I decided to make a terrible mistake. I took a look at the front wings and thought that they looked a bit boring. So I did the thing you should do with all projects that are nearly finished and completely redesigned them. And of course now they look worse. As all owners of nearly finished projects know, the next step is the most important step of all. What I did was put a sheet over the car and leave it for 3 years. So that's where we are today, a nearly finished project car that is in fact nearly finished. The first thing to do to get this car finished is to resolve the issue with the wings. So in the next video, I'm going to do what I did before and cut them into pieces, but this time do them properly. If you're interested in seeing what happens next with this project, it'd be really helpful if you would share or subscribe. Alternatively, if you just want some moral support for your own nearly finished project, pop the details in the comments below. So I fucked it up. I'd spent several weeks reshaping the front wings, only to end up with a result that I hated. After standing back and staring at them for a while, I realised I needed to have a flatter section next to where the wing joined the bonnet. There was nothing for it but to break out the angle grinder and cut up my previous hard work into pieces. And just for a change, I then hoovered up some dust while I tried to work out how on earth I was going to stick all this fiberglass back together again. As I'd hoped, after cutting out a strip from the centre of the wings, I could place the two parts side by side, and they fitted together just fine, with absolutely no gaps whatsoever.
Oh, come on!
Okay, so there might have been just a few teeny tiny little gaps. It was time to break out some metal brackets and see what I could do. After attaching all the brackets, I needed to then join the bits together permanently. So the first thing you need to do to join two panels is to grind out a trench at least half the thickness of the material. Then you apply a single layer of fiberglass about half the width of the trench. When this is cured, you then apply a second layer. Finally, you apply the same process to the underside until the two panels are completely joined. Sadly, the process in reality is a lot more messy. So there are a few things to fix, but it's still just the same basic process. Having removed the brackets, I then ground out the material underneath and filled again, with several layers of fiberglass. So that lot took a whole weekend to do. Last week, we actually made pretty decent progress, but there are a few lumps and bumps on the wings that we do need to start to improve. To do this, I use a device called a random orbital sander. And what this does is takes a sanding disc and moves it in random directions so we don't introduce too many swirl marks into the bodywork. The next stage is to identify any remaining large lumps or bumps on the bodywork. To do this, you will need the most advanced tool you have in your toolbox: your hands. Your hands are incredibly adept at finding imperfections in a smooth surface. When we identify a high spot, we circle it with a marker so we can come back to it later with the sander. You may notice in this case I'm actually using an angle grinder, but that's just because the lumps were a bit large and it was a quicker way of getting rid of them. With that done, we could turn our attention to the other wing and carry out the same process as we showed you last week. This week's tip of the week is something that I should have done last week. When I'm using the metal brackets to hold the parts together, I need to remember to cover each screw with a small piece of aluminium tape. This tape stops the screw heads from getting filled up with fiberglass, which makes them very difficult to remove. And then it's just a process of fiberglassing everything back together as I showed you last time. So with that done, it was absolutely clear that nothing could possibly have gone wrong with the process. However, just to be sure, I decided to carry out a quick measurement to make sure that both sides were symmetrical. The important measurement is that each wing is 125 millimeters below this wooden beam. Okay, so we weren't precisely symmetrical. But one of the great things about working with fiberglass is that you can always cut it back up into pieces and glue it back together again. What we needed to do was somehow find a way to shrink the fiberglass in the direction shown by these arrows so that it tightened up the curve and lowered the wing profile. I started this process by cutting horizontal slots into the wings so I could push each section down to see how much material I needed to remove. However, having tried this, it actually became clear that more drastic surgery was required. So I decided to cut out a large chunk of the wing itself to reshape it. With that out the way, it was then possible to push the other parts down and clamp them into the correct position. Then, all that was left to do was to trim the piece that I'd taken out until it fitted into the available gap. As you can see, this wedge-shaped part shows just how much we've actually had to shrink the wing by. With all that done, we then return to the usual process of grinding out each seam and fiberglassing it all back together. The next day, with the fiberglass having gone off, we could then repeat the process on the underside of the wing. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed that we have still a teeny tiny little gap between the edge of the wing and the bonnet. On the other side of the car, I actually used the section that I'd removed from the wing to be able to fill in the gap. But on balance, that had taken a lot of grinding to get it back to the right shape. So on this side, I decided to revert to the process that I'd used to create the wing shape to start with. Having roughly filled the gap using a combination of cardboard and tape, I then used expanding foam to fill in the rest of it. When dried, this foam actually sets quite hard, and you can then shape it to the curvature of the wing using traditional tools. The foam, however, does not set very quickly, so we needed to leave it a decent amount of time before we could proceed any further. With that wing nearly finished, I was then able to revert back to the other wing, which was also nearly finished and just needed small imperfections to be filled. You do sometimes feel with bodywork that it is a never-ending process. But the simple trick is to just keep going, keep iterating, keep filling small gaps, and eventually, one day, you will in fact be completely finished. So that was it for another weekend. Again, we'd made good progress. There's still loads to do, but we are getting there. So, after last week's mistakes were fixed, I was very keen for this week for everything to go really smoothly. And I'm very pleased to say, even if you look really closely, you won't see me make any mistakes whatsoever. So the first job this week was, with the expanded foam fully hardened, was to carve it to the shape that I wanted. This was carried out using a combination of a flat saw blade, an angle grinder, and the random orbital sander I showed you last time. As you can see, this is now nicely shaped, and you definitely shouldn't look too closely at this bit. Because I know I certainly didn't when I was doing the work. Now, as all the best engineers know, there's no greater material in this known universe than duct tape. Duct tape is particularly good for making car body shells, as whilst it will stick to pretty much anything, nothing sticks to it. So in this case, as I wanted to make a piece of fiberglass that I could later remove, it was the perfect thing to lay it over the top of. So with the surface suitably taped up, I could then lay a thin layer of fiberglass over the top of it. Having allowed the fiberglass to cure thoroughly, I was then able to easily remove it from the makeshift mould. The reason for doing this is I did not want the duct tape and the expanded foam underneath to become a permanent feature of the car. It was then a case of carrying out a simple cleanup on the removed piece before applying a thin layer of fiberglass so we could stick it back to the car. Now, an important point to note is that fiberglass actually sticks better if there is pressure applied to it. To achieve this, I used self-tapping screws to ensure that the new piece was firmly attached to the wing. The next day, having removed the wing, I was able to turn it over to see the work that would be required on the underside. Because nothing sticks to duct tape, I was able to easily remove the makeshift mould and remains of the expanded foam. Then it was just the usual, very messy process of grinding the surface down in preparation for another layer of fiberglass. Now, while I waited for that fiberglass to cure, I was able to get back to the process of smoothing down the other wing. This involved the process of applying a very thin layer of regular filler before going over it with the orbital sander, remembering, of course, to stop at regular intervals using your hands to check for high and low spots. Having moved onto the inner side of the wing, I discovered that with it on the car, it was actually very difficult to get everywhere with the sander, so I simply removed the wing so I could work on it separately. Finally, I was able to tidy up the rear end of the panel so it would fit better into the rear wing. So with that all done and the right hand wing fully cured, I was able to drop it back into place and look at the impressive results where everything fit absolutely perfectly. Apart from that bit we can fix. It's not too bad. And that bit too. We need to adjust that bit too. But the rest of it, yeah, that looks pretty good. Wait, what the?
Oh, come on! This week,
I will be mostly fixing last week's problem. So, yeah, in the end, last week didn't go so well. But as with all these projects, the only way to permanently fail is to permanently stop. So this week, it's back to the literal grindstone as we continue to fix problems with the wings. The first job, other than of course fixing the gaping hole at the front of the wing, is to identify other areas that need attention. Once this is done, it's back out with the angle grinder and the orbital sander to start to smooth things out. With progress made in that area, I could then start to turn my attention to the problem at the front. In order to make the necessary fix, I first had to understand precisely where the problem was. So, is it that my modified wing was too low, or is it in fact that the bonnet is too high? In order to accurately measure the bodywork, it was time to break out my new toy. Yes, it's a laser level. This projects a horizontal or vertical laser beam across the car so I can check to see if things are the same on both sides. And what this shows is that my bonnet is correct and it's the wing that is low. To be honest, this is no great surprise really, as I did spend a lot of time making those bonnets originally. I think the problem had occurred because I taped over the side of the wing to stop the fiberglass sticking to it, but hadn't been careful enough when I was applying the fiberglass to check that I was actually following the shape of the wing. So the solution was to make various different cuts into the fiberglass, wedge them into shape, and then fiberglass it all back together again. That's not bad. So then I just repeated the process on the lower part of the wing. Actually, I appreciate that probably looks terrible, but it was much smoother than it seemed. So, with the top surface of the wing modified, we could then turn our attention to the underneath. And if you've watched any of the previous videos in this series, you know what we do now. So that looks okay. The next job is to trim up the inside edge of the wing, and then we can put it back on the car.
Nice.
So with the basic shape now correct, I could return to the process of smoothing, filling, repeating, smoothing, filling, repeating, smoothing, filling, repeating. Repeating, filling, smoothing, repeating, filling, smoothing, repeating, filling, smoothing, repeating. Yeah. Now, I don't know about you, but I was starting to get bored with fixing previous week's problems.
Does it? I have had enough!
So this week, I'm pleased to say we were able to make progress. It was in fact time to decide what to do with the lower front part of the wings. But before we could design anything, I decided that I needed a blank canvas to work from. This involved using my fancy new laser level so I could draw a consistent line across both wings. With that done, it was out with the angle grinder and voila! Right, time to decide what to do next. It was quite clear to me from looking at the truncated wings that they needed to be deeper. Unfortunately, fiberglass really doesn't stick to thin air, so it was necessary to make something to be able to mould the rest of the wing over. In this case, I started by cutting off a thin strip of aluminium, or, as my American friends would call it, aluminum.
Ooh, so business now!
With this done, I was then able to clamp it to the lower edge of the wing in preparation for applying the fiberglass. And that will do nicely. Right, time to get sticky. Talking about sticky things, obviously one of the best things about fiberglass is that it will bond extremely well to itself. However, one of the more surprising things is that actually there are many things it won't bond to at all. We've talked previously about the magic properties of duct tape and the fact that fiberglass doesn't stick to it, but fiberglass will also not stick to shiny metal. So all I needed to do in this case, after the fiberglass had set, was to squeeze in a sharp blade screwdriver behind the aluminium and it popped right off. Finally, with a quick tidy up from the angle grinder, the wings were then ready to go back on the car. However, I could now see that the wings weren't quite even at the bottom, so it was back out with the laser level, the angle grinder, and things were soon straight and level. With the wings straight and even at the bottom, I was able to stand back and take a good look at them, and started to think that they looked just a bit, well, boring.
Good grief, it gets worse and worse.
So at this point, I guessed I had two choices. I could either put a simple radius on the bottom of the wing, or, alternatively, try something just a little more interesting. And if you've watched any of the other videos in this series, hopefully by now you'll start to understand that I like interesting. So what I decided to do was mould in an extra bulge at the bottom of the wing that would in some cases, and if you stood far enough away, and perhaps squinted, look a bit like a front splitter. In order to make this from fiberglass, as you've seen from the rest of this video, I need something to be able to mould it around. And in this case, having hunted around the garage, I found some pipe insulation material. This was of exactly the correct radius that I was looking for, and already came pre-split so I could simply slide it onto the bottom of the wing. With that done, it was simply a case of applying the usual duct tape and then let the fiberglassing begin. With that done, I was able to peel the fiberglass off the car, clean it up a bit, reassemble the wing back onto the car, and then clamp it all back together to see what it looked like. Overall, I think I like it. It's definitely more interesting than the other side, and I think better than just adding the simple radius. The only question was going to be how to attach it to the wing in such a way that I wouldn't see the seam. And the simple solution was going to be that I was going to have to repeat the whole process over again, but this time mould the bulge directly onto the wing. Good morning, YouTube. So this week we start the process of building the bulges on the bottom edges of the wings, but this time moulded directly to the wings themselves rather than making them separate. We start with the usual process of taping over the foam filler, but this time we also add a small seam of filler to smooth the radius between the flat wing and the curved bulge. This filler just helps the fiberglass to stick to both areas, as fiberglass really doesn't like going into very sharp corners. Then, with that done, it's on to the fiberglassing. Now you may notice at this point that I appear to be fiberglassing the floor, but what I'm actually doing is preparing the fiberglass patch on a piece of metal such I can get plenty of resin into it, and then I carefully peel it off and place it on the wing. The reason for doing this is that fiberglass takes a little while to get the resin into it, so if I do it on the floor I can make sure the patch is fully wetted before it goes on the car. Having got the basic fiberglass done, it's then time for the mind-numbingly boring element of sanding, filling and repeating. And you may notice here that the filler I'm using appears to be orange, and that's because it's actually a fiberglass paste that I use for the first layer, as this is better at filling some of the larger imperfections. The regular filler that goes on next should only really be used up to a maximum thickness of about 1mm. Now, I don't want to sound like a typical YouTuber, but it would be really helpful if you could like, comment or subscribe. Anyway, there's not too much more that I can say about the process now, so, as I believe they say in the movies, filler on, filler off. So, the way I see things, you can either get busy living or you get busy grinding. quite incredibly, we've made it to 1,000 subscribers. And essentially, that's with just 7 videos. Now, when I first started this channel, I thought if I was lucky, maybe after a year I might have got that far. But here we are, and it's all thanks to everybody who's watched, commented, and subscribed on this channel so far. So when I say we've got to 1,000 subscribers, I really do mean we. None of this would be possible without everybody watching. Having got to this milestone, I guess I better decide what to do with the channel. The original intention behind starting this was to give me an outlet for all the various different projects I started and not finished over the last 25 years. And this includes projects well outside the sphere of just cars. So, as well as not finishing car projects, I am also perfectly capable of not finishing computer games and virtual reality simulators. Oh, and there is, of course, a nearly finished novel in there as well, but the less said about that, the better. Anyway, whilst the intention was to put everything on this channel and just let the viewers decide which they wanted to look at and which bits they weren't interested in, the YouTube algorithm very much does not like that. All hail the algorithm. When I uploaded the most recent game video, I was not surprised at all that actually it only got a few hundred views. However, YouTube decided that I was no longer popular and stopped recommending the channel to anyone else. What I think I'm going to do is put the game videos and the VR simulator stuff onto a different channel and then drop the odd mention into these videos just so in case if anyone is interested they can pop over there and have a look. With regards to the virtual reality simulators, what you can see here is my current nearly finished virtual reality simulator that I've been nearly finishing now for a couple of years. It's a full motion rig, which means it moves you in all sorts of different directions whilst also blasting wind at your face at up to 150 miles an hour, as well as various different other haptic effects, including changing the shape of the seat to simulate G-force. I've actually created a number of these simulators in the past, including this bizarre steampunk one that used water barrels to compensate for your weight to make the vertical movement quicker. Or this one, working with some very skilled engineers, we very nearly got to market until COVID stopped everything. Anyway, I'll put all of that stuff onto a different channel, but it would still be extremely helpful if you could drop a message into the comments to just let me know if there's any interest in seeing this at all. Enough of that nonsense. I imagine most people are here for the cars, so let's talk about those. Obviously, so far, I've only featured the one project car, but there are many others that are still nearly finished. My question is, do you want me to only work on that one project until we get it a lot more finished, or do you want me to take occasional breaks to feature other small projects that just break up the channel a bit? For example, what you're seeing here is my heavily modified 1989 Jaguar XJ RS. It's nearly finished to the degree that if I could solve one problem with the engine management system such that it runs roughly, I could get it MOT'd and start driving it. The question is, are you interested in watching a video where I spend the weekend stripping the fuel system, draining out the old fuel, and messing around with all the injectors, and probably swearing at it a lot? But it would of course mean that it would be a week without progress on the other main project. Pop your thoughts in the comments and let me know. Right, that's enough of all of that. And whilst I was away on holiday last week, I did manage to get some car stuff done. And finally, after what seems like weeks messing around chopping the wings up, it was time to get on to positioning the headlights. And what you can see here is me unwrapping something that I've had in my loft for years. A genuine headlight pod from a Jaguar XK120. And what you see right here is me putting the headlight pod onto the car and discovering that it doesn't remotely fit.
Well, come on!
So I'm glad I spent 10 years carefully storing that. But these things happen. So it's on to plan B. I hunted around the garage to try and find something else of around the same shape and size that I needed that I could mould fiberglass around. And luckily, the CO2 gas cylinder from my welder seemed to fit the job perfect. So it was out with the duct tape and the brown paper so I could get it ready to be able to mould fiberglass on. I'll show you how I got the fiberglass off the mould in a moment, and it's definitely not because I forgot to record that the first time round, but this is what it looks like roughly attached to the car. I think it looks good enough to be able to proceed with doing the same on the other side, and the process of getting the fiberglass off the mould involves hammering screwdrivers between the fiberglass and the cylinder until it comes loose. Now, if you look carefully, you may even see that the fiberglass is split in a couple of places, but this doesn't really matter as it's only a single thickness and we're about to add a lot more fiberglass over the top of it. So then, with the fiberglass loosely placed back onto the mould, I could then add a second layer as well as going over the top bits again. And with that process finally complete, I could then start to work out how on earth I was going to get these two headlight pods into the car in an even and level way. There's only one thing for it. We need
sophisticated heat beam, which we called a laser.
Yep, it's time to break out the laser level and to record lots of data points from side to side to carefully measure where the two holes should be. With the two light pods roughly in place, it was time to work out now how to make sure I could get them exactly even. And the easiest way I could think of to do this was to bolt the two light pods together with a wooden plank. With that done, I could break out the you-know-what and start messing around until I got them to the exact right positions. Finally, by not breathing too close to them, I was then able to apply a thin layer of fiberglass paste to hold them in position. Obviously, we're going to fiberglass over these properly when we're completely happy with things, so the fiberglass paste is really just a temporary measure. But I just had to be extraordinarily careful not to dislodge anything while I was going about the process. Then, with the paste fully set, I could go round it with a sander to smooth things out. And there we are, the first draft of the headlight pods. Let me know what you think. I'm not completely convinced we've got everything right yet, so put your thoughts in the comments and together we'll find a way to make this car look amazing. Last time I asked if people were interested in hearing about the games and the VR simulators, and the general response seems to have been,
I'm not fucking interested.
Actually, that's not even remotely what people said. I just like the clip. But putting that content onto a separate channel and occasionally linking to it appear to be okay with most people. Anyway, back to cars. In the last video, I put together the first version of the light pods, and having stood back and looked at them for a while, combined with lots of really useful comments from viewers, it became very clear that the general consensus was that they were much too small. And sometimes size really does matter. There were lots of other comments along the lines of the wings being too flat at the front. These are all very valid comments, so it was time to break out the cardboard and come up with some ideas for some grills to put into the lower wings. So obviously, like, share and subscribe as usual, but let me know in the comments what you think. I'm going to be doing the updates to the front wings with these grills this weekend, so there is an opportunity for everyone to have their say. One thing that was very obvious was that everybody wanted the headlights to be bigger, and I agree. So this is how I went about fixing that. Unfortunately, this time I couldn't find anything obvious to mould around, so I decided to actually use the existing pods, even though they were too small, as a starting point. And the first thing to do was to create 2 wooden templates of the right diameter for the headlights that I decided to use. And the headlights that I've decided to use are actually the same as the ones from my Cobra replica. So with those templates screwed to the existing light pods, I could then play around with them till I got them into the exact right place. And in order to be accurate, you know what we use. As I want to make sure that I've got everything exactly correct before it becomes permanent, I've decided to make these light pods temporarily removable once they've been created. So everything gets covered in duct tape. Next, it was time to get really sticky by using expanding foam to fill the gap behind the templates. Now, as I've said in previous videos, this stuff takes a little while to go off, so having sprayed it onto the car, I decided to leave it overnight until it was nice and hard. And what could possibly go wrong? Yeah, so the foam somewhat sagged overnight. But after looking at it, I realised that it actually wasn't too much of a problem. So I broke out the hacksaw blade, got out the sander, and started shaping.
Tell me how you sleep at night with all the things you've done. Maybe it's just gin and justifications. Tell me how you pray to gods whose hands are red with blood. As pretty as you are, it's pretty sad what you've become. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, just sick inside, and I'm not. Tell me how you do it. Maybe I could learn from you how to take the hate and ignorance and make it a virtue. You just make it look so easy. Yeah.
They say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. But whilst it does feel like I do seem to spend a lot of my time making videos about light pods, I can, this time, absolutely, definitely guarantee this is the last time I'm doing it.
Never again.
So, to the surprise of absolutely no one who's watched any of my videos in the past, you will now see me covering the expanded foam with tape before we fiberglass over the top of it. Stopping off on the way with some very careful measurement to make sure everything is equal. One thing I did notice as I was putting the tape on is that there was quite a sharp edge between the light pod and the wing itself. So in order to smooth that out, as fiberglass does not like sharp corners, I added some extra filler. This is of course purely temporary and won't form any part of the final moulded shape. After that was done, it would then be a case of sanding it down to make it completely smooth. So, cue the montage music.
Tell me how you sleep at night with all the things you've done. Maybe it's just gin and justifications. Tell me how you pray to gods whose hands are red with blood. As pretty as you are, it's pretty sad what you've become. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me, last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not. Tell me how you do it. Maybe
I'm not sure what's worse. The fact is you've just spent a minute and a half of your life that you're not getting back watching a man stick tape on his car, or the fact is I spent a couple of hours doing it. Anyway, not to worry. Here's me now sticking fiberglass all over the top of it. The intention here is not to actually create the full final thickness, but really just a starter that I can use to prise these pods off the car eventually before we then glue them back on and then add the thicker layers later. What you'll see me doing here is, having done the first layer of fiberglass, is then to give everything a quick sand over before I do the next layer. The reason for doing this is it's actually very easy when applying fiberglass to leave the odd strand sticking up. And if you then apply another layer over the top without removing this, you end up with a lot of air voids between the different layers. On with the next layer, and I think 2 thicknesses should do for what I want at this stage. In case anyone is interested, I'm using a low odour fiberglass resin and a medium speed catalyst. Typically, at this time of year, with the amount of catalyst I use, the fiberglass resin will go off to the degree that I can sand it again in about 30 to 40 minutes. That was as much as I managed to get through on the first day of this light pod extravaganza. But the next day, before I got on with the entertaining work of trying to get these light pods off the car, there was one very, very important step left to do. I needed to ensure that having got the light pods off the car, that I could get them back into exactly the same positions they came from. So to do this, I simply drilled some holes so I could put in some self-tapping screws. With that done, it was then a case of breaking out every flat-bladed screwdriver I had, a hammer and a large length of metal in order to prise the pods off the car. With that all done, I was then able to trim the edges of the light pods with the angle grinder and then place them back on the wings of the car. And fortunately, having remembered to drill those holes earlier, they dropped right back into place and I could then self-tap them to the wing. And there you go. They actually fit perfectly. So next time, we'll need to remove the foam core from underneath and fiberglass them permanently. Here we go again. I don't know about you, but I'm starting to get bored of the endless videos where I just grind down fiberglass and stick bits of wings back together again.
Are you not entertained?
The good news is, and you'll have to forgive the pun here, but we are, in fact, really nearly finished.
I don't believe a word of it. A single blinking word of it.
No, really, we are. I've actually decided at this stage not to put the grills in that I talked about previously. And so, after this video, there will be one more final episode on the wings, and then we can do something else. What you see me doing here is cutting out the apertures behind the light pods and then permanently attaching them by bonding the new light pods to the wings. And I actually think they look pretty good. So by the time we've got the lights and the indicators and the side lights on, I don't think we need anything else on the front at this stage. So having bonded the lights to the top parts of the wings, it was then necessary to get to the underneath so I could glass the undersides together. And by now, you all will know the process that we go through, so cue the montage music. Having done that, it was then time to get the final fitment of the wings sorted out. And in order to do that, it meant finally getting the front grille to fit properly. Now, this is something that's been annoying me for about 10 years, so it was really good to finally get round to grinding it all down, filling it, and filling in the gaps on the side of it. However, before we could get to the stage of showing you that I can do more than just grind down fiberglass and make a general mess, it was necessary to grind down the existing welded seams and to sand off any inevitable surface rust. Fortunately, I had previously painted the underside with zinc paint, so it was only the outside that needed attention. Fortunately, it all cleaned up pretty nicely, so with a few minutes grinding, we were then ready to get on with the next part. The keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed that in other videos, there was in fact a large gap part the way down the front grille where the metalwork just didn't meet the wings. This was in fact a previous oversight of mine where I just misjudged how the wings would attach to the grille. So in order to fix this, it was simply a case of make a template in card of the right shape, cut it out of metal, and then weld it to the grille. With the metal piece cut and shaped to the right curvature, it was then time to weld it to the grille. And the important thing to note when welding steel bodywork is that the steel is in fact incredibly thin. So if you put too much heat into it, you'll either blow a hole through it, or the heat will cause such distortion to the metal that it'll take you forever to get it back to the right shape again. So what you see me doing here is a series of small tacks at various different points along the seam, allowing enough time for the metal to cool between each weld. Having checked the welds to make sure they'd fully penetrated through to the other side of the metal, I could then start the process of grinding them flush. Now, you can probably see that there is some distortion on the metal, so it was out with the hammer and the dolly to try and get everything back to the shape it should be. Now, for all you filling and sanding fans, don't worry. It wouldn't be a video from nearly finished if we didn't include plenty of that. The good news is after all the hammer work, the filler itself goes on incredibly thinly and is really there just to cover up the worst of the hammer marks. And overall, whilst this wasn't a job that I was necessarily planning on doing at this stage, I'm really glad I did, because it brings the whole front of the car together and helps me understand what it's going to look like when it's all done. This is, of course, all great until you then discover, when you put the wings back on, that they don't fit. Actually, to be honest, that wasn't too much of a surprise. I was expecting to need to do some final shaping before the wings could go back on properly. I also needed to be able to create a couple of extra brackets so I would be able to bolt the wings on without any visible fixings showing. So what you see me doing here is cutting and drilling 2 small brackets from 30mm steel bar. These brackets will eventually be bonded to the wings, but it's incredibly important to make sure that they are located in exactly the right place. So having drilled the necessary mounting holes, I was then able to weld on captive nuts that will eventually be used to bolt the wings on. We of course want to make sure that the bonding agent sticks the bracket to the wing and not to the car. So we applied the usual layer of duct tape before bolting the bracket on. So that was about all the time I had this weekend. I really do appreciate everybody sticking with me through this long, drawn-out process of getting these wings done, but I do promise next time out will be the last time we work on the front wings for quite some time. Well, it's been a long journey, but finally we're on the last part of the front wings. Well, for now at least anyway. The channel is, after all, called Nearly Finished, so you wouldn't expect me to be any further along than nearly finished. What it does mean, though, is with this out of the way, we can get on to fixing a lot of the other issues that are still with the car, but I think we'll move the whole project further forward quite quickly. What you can see me doing here is the usual round of grinding, filling, and more grinding, but this time it's for the final fit and finish to make sure that the wings connect up to the bonnet and the front grille properly. Normally, between opening panels, such as the bonnets or the doors, I aim for around 3mm of clearance. This gives you enough gap such that if you trap something like a coat in between the door and the body when you're shutting it, that it doesn't cause bodywork damage. However, between the wings and the front grille, I'm aiming for a gap of around 1mm to allow for the later thickness of paint when we apply it. Next, I'm applying fiberglass paste between the light pods and the body. Whilst the light pods are already bonded to the car, I wanted to make sure that the join would not crack later on. I then do the same process on the final join between the wings and the grille. Before we get to the epic grinding montage, I also fiberglassed in this tab on the top of the wing so that I can bolt it to the chassis with a hidden fixing. Right, for one last time on this part of the project, cue the epic music.
Tell me how you sleep at night with all the things you've done. Maybe it's just gin and justifications. Tell me how you pray to gods whose hands are red with blood. As pretty as you are, it's pretty sad what you've become. Don't try to come and save my soul. Don't try to pray to bring me home.
Sorry to interrupt the epic music, but you can see me here with sandpaper wrapped around a metal pole. It's very important to do this to ensure a uniform curve where the light pod meets the wing. And it's a very common mistake to try and form smooth curves with the sandpaper wrapped around your fingers.
How you do it. Maybe I could learn from you how to take the hate and ignorance and make it a virtue. You just make it look so easy.
You can see me here also applying a thin layer of fiberglass paste, as I actually discovered that the shape of the wing wasn't quite correct. I won't normally apply filler to a thickness of more than 1mm, and I think it needed about 1.5 to 2, so that's why I decided to use the fiberglass paste.
Don't try to pray to bring me home. It's the last time you'll see me. Last time to God. You're beautiful, you're sick inside, and I'm not like Joan of Arc without the flames, like Jesus Christ without the pain. Just come down off that cross, you're not the same.
Fuck.
Whilst I was making this video, I found this thing growing on the inside of my filler pot. What the f*** is it? Anyway, on with the final part of the montage. With that lot out of the way, it was finally time to start bolting on some shiny bits. I think I've mentioned in a previous video that these are the same headlights as I've used on my AC Cobra replica. They're relatively cheap, but they're definitely in keeping with the style of the car that we're going for. They consist of a plastic bowl that you screw onto the car itself, remembering not, of course, to forget the rubber gasket that sits behind it. And I absolutely, definitely didn't forget to put it on the first time I assembled the lights. This plastic bowl is then followed by the actual light unit itself, which is held onto the car by the 2 adjustment screws that are used to set the light beam later on, and a third pivot screw that just keeps everything secure. Finally, there's a chrome trim that goes over the whole light fitting, and this is secured in with a final single self-tapping screw. And there we have it. I was really quite happy with those, so it was then time to move on to the indicators and side lights. In keeping with the general British theme of the car, I decided that for the indicators and side lights, we would go for those off an early Land Rover. Now these also are commonly used on Cobra replicas, but I'm not sure whether they're truly authentic for that purpose. However, in this case, I think they look perfectly acceptable for what we need here. So to install these, it was out with the laser level to ensure that they're exactly even both sides, and a hole saw. Unfortunately, I didn't have a hole saw of the exact 34mm diameter that I needed, but it was the work of a moment with a Dremel and a sanding flap disc to open up the holes to the exactly correct size that we needed. And with that done, everything dropped exactly into place. So there we go. After 12 epic weeks of cutting, grinding and sanding, the front wings are done. Well, done enough for now. I'll need to revisit them later for final sanding and fitting, and possibly still add some spotlights or some front grills, but they'll certainly do for now. The question is, of course, what are we going to do next?
Now what the are we supposed to do? Game over, man. It's game over. What the are we gonna do now? What are we gonna do?
Easy there, Corporal. With the wings out of the way, there's going to be a 1 week gap where I work on a side project, and that is trying to get my 6-litre Jaguar XJ-RS to run properly. This is a problem that's been annoying me for quite some time. The car itself had a recent complete engine rebuild, but it just doesn't run properly afterwards. And I think the issue is to do with either the injectors or the fuel system itself. So, for 1 week only, you're going to see me and a friend of mine swearing at it until it works properly. After that, we'll be back to this project car again. And I think the first thing that I'll do is make a video where I take you through all the bits of the car that we're still yet to finish. And then, from there, we can decide what bit to do first. So that's it for the first part of this project car project. If you've got this far but haven't subscribed yet, it would be really helpful if you could. It really helps the channel grow and keeps me motivated to make more videos.